Hello, my name is Dr. Rhiannon Firth. I'm a lecturer in sociology at UCL Institute of Education. My research is at the intersection of sociology, education and politics, with a focus on the pedagogical and prefigurative practices of new social movements. And I've conducted lots of funded research for social movements. And I also do theoretical and historical research on social movements of the past. I'm the author of 3 books: Utopian Politics, Coronavirus, Class and Mutual Aid in the UK, and a forthcoming book, Disaster Anarchy, alongside several book chapters and articles. So today I'm going to be presenting an adapted version of a paper which I published several years ago now, but which I feel has become even more relevant in the context of the contemporary crisis of capitalism caused by COVID-19. You can read the original version of this paper, open access, in the journal Ephemera. And I'm really excited to have been invited to present at this exciting event on neoliberalism and mental health, which is precisely the topic of the paper. I'll be critiquing some of the ways in which neoliberalism sort of construes and affects mental health, as well as looking at some radical alternatives. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, hopefully. If I can figure out how to do this. Share screen. Oops. Not that. Okay. So the paper is called Somatic Pedagogies, Critiquing and Resisting the Effective Discourse of the Neoliberal State from an Embodied Anarchist Perspective. Most of my research I write from a sort of anti-authoritarian anarchist perspective. And the movement I look at in this, Soma Therapy particularly, has origins in anarchist theory, amongst other things. Okay, so a summary of the paper I'll be presenting today. I'm going to give some context on what anxiety is in neoliberal society and how neoliberal society produces anxiety in particular. I'll be looking at affect and the conformist subject. I'll give more detailed explanation of that terminology, which might be unfamiliar to some people. I'll be looking at well-being, resilience and therapeutic education. I'll be looking at the neglect of the body and some of the critical alternatives that exist. And then I'll have a look at some alternative pedagogies of the body, or somatic pedagogies, which is the title of the paper. Okay, so neoliberal anxiety is a term that I get from the Institute for Precarious Consciousness. Well, I get the conceptualization from this article by the Institute of Neoliberal Consciousness that was published in 2014. I'd highly recommend that article to anyone, probably even more so than my own article on this. The Institute for Precarious Consciousness gives a history of kind of the ways in which capitalism has affected sort of mental health on a kind of social level, and they argue that the rise of industrialism was characterized by misery, and they argue that one of the best accounts of this is sort of Marx's account of the immiseration of the proletariat. The later Fordist period of sort of massified capitalism and very monotonous factory jobs and a universal but bureaucratic welfare state was very much characterized by boredom. There was an amount of security, but work was very repetitive. And they argue that the contemporary period, the sort of post-Fordist period, work has become more precarious. We see a lot of zero-hour contracts, sort of algorithmic management in sort of companies like Uber, withdrawal of benefits, and sort of the sort of receding of the welfare state, continuously impossible targets that people are set that just aren't possible for people to meet, and basically just sort of the financialization of the economy and so on, leading to global outsourcing and things. Are just everybody's capitalism is in crisis, and people's lives are precarious, and this causes a huge amount of anxiety. And that article explores in depth many of the reasons for this. Okay, so affect and the conformist subject. So affect is a term that's used a lot in sort of critical sociology and social theory, and it refers to emotion, relation. It's sort of a holistic concept. It refers to more than just emotion, because emotion's quite an individualized concept, but affect is something that sort of flows through bodies, to do with sort of structures of society, structurations of desire, and so on. And it's about the sort of interaction of bodies and the relations between them. And affect theory tends to draw heavily on philosophers like Spinoza and Deleuze. So in my paper, following some other theorists, I argue that the state, the neoliberal state, as in the government, which seeks to sort of support, it's a state in capitalism that seeks to sort of support and stabilize capitalism, uses discourses of affect to harness biopower. So basically the kind of discourses the state uses around our feelings and emotions and so on are created to produce and reproduce compliant subjects who are able to deal with the anxiety that is produced by this kind of crisis-prone capitalism. So at the same time, there's been a turn to affect in critical academia. So as I say, this idea of affect is very popular in critical sociology, and these theories attempt to produce critical pedagogies. By pedagogy, I mean sort of forms of education and learning that are able to resist state-affected discourse. So critical sociologists try to show us ways in which we can identify and critique and resist the ways in which the government seeks to mobilize our mental health and our sort of feelings and desires in ways that support capitalism. However, in the paper, I argue that the problem with some of these critical pedagogies and critical perspectives is that they elide or diminish the role of the body in effective resistance. So even though they're critical, I argue even critical academia neglects the body. So well-being, resilience and therapeutic education. There's a very popular book by Eccleston and Hayes, Catherine Eccleston and Dennis Hayes, called The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education. They cite a deluge of interventions throughout the education system that assess the emotional needs and perceived emotional vulnerability of children, young people and adults, and claim to develop their emotional literacy and well-being. Now, throughout this paper, when I talk about education and pedagogies, public pedagogies, I'm not just talking about what happens in school, I'm also talking about what happens in the media that also educates us as adults, I guess, and popular culture and so on. All of these are sites of education and learning. So some examples, in primary school, we've had philosophy for children classes, which include interventions to assess the emotional needs and perceived vulnerability of children, and interventions to develop emotional literacy, aspects of citizenship education, and personal, social, and health education. In colleges and universities, there's been induction programs, modules. The induction programs often sort of contain an emotional or well-being element. There's modules that claim to build self-esteem and confidence in their kind of descriptors. And we also see student satisfaction surveys, as though satisfaction is, student sort of experience and satisfaction is some indicator of learning in a sense. It's sort of the idea is that students should be happy and enjoy their learning, that it shouldn't be sort of uncomfortable for them, which is problematic because critical learning can often be uncomfortable because it involves being confronted with difficult things about the world. But often, you know, when student, you know, when lecturers, for example, are measured and sort of disciplined according to how happy they make the students, you know, it can avoid, it can encourage us to avoid more difficult subjects. or uncomfortable subjects. In the workplace, we also see activities to deal with stress, harassment, bullying, appraisal and performance reviews that focus on emotional well-being. So the idea is that we sort of have to be happy at work, and that's a sort of moral good rather than, you know, it's sort of we have an obligation at work to be happy and so on. Also in cultural pedagogies and popular education, we see an abundance of online psychology tests and self-help books and so on. So all of these are sort of the ways in which neoliberalism construes mental health as a kind of public and moral obligation, I guess. Okay, so thinking of some recent examples. Certainly with sort of, it's a long time ago now, but when there was the sort of new Labour government, Blair and so on, there was a huge, this is when this sort of focus on well-being seems to really come to the fore. But with the Conservatives, there seems to be more of a focus on kind of panic and fear and securitization. But there still seems to be a focus on emotional intelligence, and resilience is a very important keyword. We also see it in research funding bodies. So I'm going back a while now, but the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council's strategic priorities from 2011 to 2015, had a theme of influencing behaviour and informing interventions. Now, obviously, that's a while ago, but we can really see the ways in which that became, that kind of research is absolutely dominant now in the ways in which the coronavirus crisis has been sort of managed. There's been a lot of emphasis on shaping people's behaviour, controlling the ways in which people react and behave. So this sort of nudge theory, gamification and things like this. So the idea is that well-being is about willingness and ability to work, and underlying all this is a desire to reduce welfare expenditure. If you put the obligations and responsibilities for mental well-being onto individuals, then you know, it removes it from sort of being a public obligation. Furthermore, discourses of discipline and securitization that we've also seen a lot of during the COVID crisis also mobilize affect in the form of fear. So they rest on the same assumptions of vulnerable subjects in need of state protection. So the state is there to sort of control and protect us, but at the same time it sort of withdraws material support and so on and places those obligations on us. We can see some examples of this in counter-terrorism adverts, like sort of this picture here: family home, drugs den, terrorist cell, and then it's got some doorbells. So, you know, we're to be afraid of doorbells now and suspicious of one another. There's a quote here from the government which very much equates well-being with the ability to work. It's not about how you feel or, you know, your ability to meet your own personal values and goals and aims, or your community values, goals and aims. It's very much about your ability to meet society's needs. But by society, they mean capitalism. And this is very much embedded in even sort of interventions with children, you know, this idea of resilience. So if we move on to thinking about more recently the relevance for the coronavirus crisis, this sort of, everyone will have seen this: stay alert, follow the rules, we can control the virus. So it's very much it's like the gamification of health. Health becomes a sort of personal responsibility in which the sick are perceived to have failed. And it's very much the same with mental well-being. The idea that, you know, we have to just pause, take breaks, make time, reach out. It's our responsibility to reach out and seek help. But it also very much treats everyone as the same in a way. So it doesn't talk about things that like class or inequality, the idea that you can stay safe and stay home and just reach out to others. And these are sort of options that are available to everybody, completely ignores the fact that home is not a safe place for some people, or some people are unable to reach out to other people because they don't have anyone, or it very much places the responsibility on the individual, but treats the individual as a kind of generic sort of capitalist node. Okay, so let's think of a critique of these pedagogies. I call them pedagogies because they're teaching us. So the government is teaching us forms of sort of preparedness for disaster that are very individualized. And they rest on assumptions of a diminished self that kind of requires assessment and intervention. So it's a kind of social engineering. It creates a culture of narcissism, vulnerability and isolation, and diminished agency. This is all from Eccleston and Hayes, by the way, but I'm on board with their critique. I'm not necessarily on board with their alternatives. It's an insidious means of surveillance and control. So often, like wellbeing interventions at work are used not to help people sort of feel more fulfilled in their life in the sense that sort of maybe person-centered forms of counselling would, but they're actually used to sort of assess and survey workers. It's also an individualized discourse that channels subjects towards narrow neoliberal desires and conceals the social and material causes of anxiety, rendering them what's called a public secret. So everyone knows that they're anxious, but they don't know that everyone else is. And that's used to control people. Okay, so critical pedagogy and the politics of affect. So therapeutic education, these therapeutic interventions in education that appear to have our best interests at heart, you know, mindfulness and all these things we can do for ourselves to make ourselves able to cope with frightening work conditions and so on. They raise some specific issues for critical theorists and educators. So if students and populations are trained to accept, adapt to, and ultimately desire a precarious life in neoliberal societies, how might we persuade them otherwise, without us also presuming that these people are diminished and in need of our intervention and control? So how do we help people become, how do we raise consciousness without imposing our own desires or for sort of criticality and radicalism or so on people? So some existing alternatives in critical academia include Sarah Ansler's fantastic work on developing critical awareness of the role of emotions and affect and problematizing emotional responses to critique. So the idea here is students can become emotional and uncomfortable when dealing with critical pedagogies. And that ties into what I was saying about student satisfaction not necessarily being a very good indicator of learning earlier. Also, there's some great work on opening non-hierarchical spaces for discussion and engagement with otherness, and I'd highly recommend the work of Sarah Motter on this. And there's a large body of literature on pedagogies of affect and emotional pedagogies and so on that talk about acknowledging a role for unpleasant affects and emotions in class, for example, ambiguity and discomfort, when talking about the ways in which we've been sort of, you know, our desires have been shaped by neoliberalism, the way we've been abandoned by society and so on. You know, these are difficult topics for many students. So the neglect of the body. So my I think original contribution to this body of literature is the idea that all these critical pedagogies, which are fantastic, are based on discussion, dialogue, and critical thought only. They assume that emotions are discursive rather than physical in origin and effect, and they maintain a mind-body dualism and hierarchy. So they maintain a very strong split between the mind and the body, which I dispute. So I feel like we have to bring the body in when we're talking about mental health and emotions, and this is affect theory. The sort of theories of affect by Deleuze and Spinoza and so on would say the same, that there isn't this sort of split between mind and body that's often presumed. So my wish is not to supplant these ideas, but to supplement them. I also wish to maintain emphasis on non-hierarchy and openness. So rather than trying to program people with alternative desires, radical desires, it's about opening up space for people to explore their own critique and desires. So I've looked in history and elsewhere in society, which is the methodology I usually use in sort of radical social movements, and historically for non-hierarchical and liberatory pedagogies that invert or transgress the mind-body dualism and dynamic, and the idea that the mind is more important than the body. By beginning from the reconceptualized body. And one of my favorite examples is Soma Therapy, which not many people have heard of. I completely accidentally ended up at a workshop, and it was one of the most sort of profoundly liberatory experiences I've had. It was absolutely fantastic. And this is something that was invented by a Brazilian psychiatrist called Roberto Freire, not related to Paulo Freire, the originator of critical pedagogy. It's a different person, but he's absolutely fantastic. I'd highly recommend his work. Unfortunately, not a lot of it has been translated into English. And he was an anarchist. He was explicitly anarchist, and he invented this he invented this therapy that draws on the radical psychology of Wilhelm Reich, and also on the Brazilian martial art capoeira. And it uses physical movement and dance to help us unlearn the musculature armor, he calls it. And that's very much drawing on the work of Wilhelm Reich, that capitalist life and work imposes on us. So the idea is that our job, whatever that is, if it's like me sitting at a computer all day, being a researcher, or whether you're working in a factory, obviously it gives us a sort of bodily rigidity, which is very much implicated in our mental and physical health, just as much as kind of the anxiety that neoliberalism imposes on us. So his desire is not to develop athletic bodies, but to rediscover bodily difference, autonomy, and build collectivity. He aims to mobilize affects of creativity, trust, and feelings of freedom, starting from the body. And his sessions often end in a critical discussion about the affects that have been aroused by the session. Also, another example that I think is really useful to think about is Theatre of the Oppressed, which is another pedagogy created by Augusto Boal, which aims to change spectators, the sort of monologic version of the theatre where you have the actors and then the people who are sort of passive spectators, into actually being actors and transformers of the dramatic action. Again, similarly to Freire, he talks about how alienated and repetitive labour imposes a mask of behaviour whereby work governs the body. So the first task of liberatory theatre is to raise this to the level of consciousness and study and analyse the different forces that affect participants' bodies. So he uses a variety of exercises and games. Again, these are very sort of embodied things rather than simply being about sitting in a chair and discussing. There's also the sort of critical or radical tradition of psychogeography, which involves exploring the effects of the geographical environment on human behaviour through a variety of playful strategies like walking and mapping through the urban environment. And this is from the work of Guy Debord. And there's various examples of these. I'm going to skip past these now. There's also some academics have written about the role, the potentially liberatory and radical role of dance and music. And I love having a good dance. So I definitely agree with that. And I think these works have a lot to say about how we can resist anxiety and neoliberalism and sort of build a collective subject and critical consciousness. And somebody crying very loudly in my street outdoors, which seems very relevant background for this presentation, but it's quite sad to listen to. I'm not sure what's going on there. I don't think you can hear it, but I can hear it. Okay, so conclusion, key themes. the state, in attempting to produce compliant neoliberal subjects, uses discourses and affects designed to capture the affective force of fear and anxiety, often cloaked in discourses of well-being. Critical pedagogy attempts to resist this in educational and cultural settings through a counter-discourse of affect. But as I said, this often involves people just sitting down and discussing things as though it's an intellectual problem. So what I argue in my paper, which I hope some of you might go on to read in Ephemera Journal, as well as the article by the Institute of Precarious Consciousness that I draw on quite heavily in there, what is missing is a somatic understanding of affects that takes into account the whole body and its relationships to disalienated level. This opens up possibilities for pedagogies that begin from movement, dance and play rather than from language. I've got a list of references here. I'm not sure, I'll make sure that these are available to the organisers in case anyone wants to follow them up. And I'd highly recommend, if anyone's interested on Soma Therapy and the life of Roberto Freire, I'd really recommend this documentary, which is available on YouTube. Okay, so that's my presentation. I'm really looking forward to attending the event and answering questions and being involved in discussion. Thank you very much.